The entire galaxy kept a reverent silence before the Council, an institution forged over ages as a bastion of order. For countless centuries, emerging civilizations grew under the weight of those silent decisions. The absence of conflict was maintained not by mutual trust, but by the tacit understanding of mutual destruction. It was a cold peace, unshakable, built upon well-contained fear. This was the stage on which humans appeared as a dissonant note, not by force, nor by polished diplomacy, but by the audacity of the unexpected. And then, cutting through that ancestral stillness, came a transmission. A simple sentence, yet laden with direct threat. "We have the weapon that can destabilize you." These were not traditional words, nor ceremony. It was a raw, blunt warning from a species, until then treated as a curiosity. But what no one expected was that it was only a bluff. No invisible arsenal waited to be unleashed, only the strength of conviction, of uncertainty. A message engineered as a false energy pulse, technically crafted to look legitimate, minimal. Output: an obscure, decentralized energy signature, an artifice that seeded doubt where there had been only neutrality. As the Council's sensors picked up the pulse, alien minds read more than noise. They saw intention, they saw will. Tension spread through stellar corridors before anyone even pressed a button. And for a moment, even the Council laughed. It was a brief laugh. Because once that tremor of uncertainty ran through the diplomatic structure, no one laughed for long. The galaxy ceased to be static in an instant. To understand the effect of that bluff, one must notice the power of human unpredictability. Humans did not need to prove strength, only to suggest possibility. An admiral, isolated, tore the fabric of that order. In a solitary war room, she used technical knowledge, the logic of OODA: observe, orient, decide, act, to saturate the Council's analysis systems with ambiguity. Her message did not say, "We will destroy you." It said, "We could, who knows?" That gradient of doubt spread like a virus. Meanwhile, the Council was crafting a response in silence. They did not declare war. There was no announcement of retaliation. Instead, they began to deploy observers, strategists, camouflaged on human worlds as a precaution. A quiet, efficient, invisible diplomatic move, vigilance, disguised as caution. Humans felt the weight of that observation. Alliances wavered, consultancies withdrew, treaties were revisited without public notice. Diplomacy became entangled in invisible networks. Suddenly, isolation ceased to be physical and became political. In scientific bases, research was paused, collaborations ended, access to advanced technologies evaporated. Not through formal blockade, but through tacit apprehension. The original communication sounded smaller beside the magnitude of the consequences. And at the same time, humanity's image gained a new nuance on the galactic networks. That human bluff became a matter of debate. "They're not a threat," some began to say, but added, "They're unpredictable." The surprise took root. Unpredictability became a status. Humans were not powerful in militarism. They were dangerous for being unstable. This new reputation brought constant surveillance, curiosity mixed with misgiving. Eyes began to turn toward Earth more intently, as if expecting signs of new audacity, not explosions. Meanwhile, in interstellar commerce, routes that once pulsed were now empty. Human cargo ships were detained, inspected, forced to get authorization at every jump. Bureaucracy became a field of inefficiency and friction. The sanctions did not come from weapons, but from paperwork. Delays, authorizations, denied or postponed. The flow of transport was blocked by invisible fears. Resources, time, trust, and patience were lost. And the isolation of silence blossomed. In response, human colonies began to protect themselves. They developed protocols for masking energy signatures, altering their pulses. Spoofing systems were implemented. Diplomatic communication became encrypted with intentional false layers. It was not flight. It was tactics. They insisted on enigma to survive. The purpose was to hide from tracking, to maintain active invisibility. As defense, and deep down, they wondered, won't the Council discover this metamorphosis? In the end, the borders shifted. They were no longer drawn on maps, but in zones of silence and discomfort. Humanity was set apart, not exterminated. Respected but with evident distrust. Eternal peace had evaporated. Fragmented silence emerged. Humans lost diplomatic freedom, but gained the power of being the enigma, the unexpected. The bluff failed. To be smothered, it was a double-edged sword. In exchange for respect, we sacrificed fluidity. But being unpredictable can be the hardest defense to penetrate. Now, somewhere in space, another transmission may arise. A new pulse, can at last redefine everything once more. A new uncertainty hangs in the air, waiting to be fired. The pulse that broke the galactic silence did not disappear. It became a seed germinating in fertile soil of doubts and enigmas. The Council reacted not with fury, but with drawn-out prudence. Observers were assigned diplomatic agents who never identified themselves as such. They arrived as merchants. Academics, explorers, mingled with the masses. Their presence was a silent shadow hovering over human colonies, leaving traces of uncertainty where calm hope of exchange had existed before. Humans felt that collective gaze. They began to question every jump, every connection. What had been a trade route turned tense route, and the new bureaucracies were not drawn in ink, but in universal apprehension. Diplomacy became a slow dance among calculated silences, hidden codes, and vetoed dispatches. Trade, once a bridge, now belonged to the realm of slow surveillance. Caravans were stopped at checkpoints, cargoes minutely inspected, authorizations took months. Human commerce got bogged down in paperwork and bonds. There was no formal declaration of war, but the rupture was palpable. At the center of each colony, an orchestrated hub erased signatures and echoed distortions. Every ship's jump had layers of spoofing. Human communicators learned to leave deliberate false trails. Encryption layers with intentionally introduced flaws, energy signatures polluted with noise. Even the AI managing fleet communications had been tuned to generate misleading frequencies if detected. The pulse would look legitimate yet false. This countercode became a silent shield. It was invisible protection, a bulwark made of deliberate dissimulation. That atmosphere shaped humanity's reputation in an irreversible way. In galactic forums, the species that once sparked curiosity now provoked wary fascination. They are not predators, some remarked, but we cannot predict what they will do. A simple phrase, unpredictable, began to appear in reports, in diplomatic scales, in security protocols. Human unpredictability became a political equation. Deliberate uncertainty came to be worth more than visible threats. Thus, a new architecture of power was built. Humans became the elegant pariah of galactic order. No one said we shall attack. They simply watched, circled, contemplated. Asterisk on that threshold. Humanity reacted contingently. It took refuge in tactical introspection. Better than shields was to be invisible. Better than showing strength was to cultivate enigma. And yet territorial isolation did not mean spiritual confinement. Internally, the colonies flourished in self-sufficiency. Technologies that would once have been shared were now reinvented within closed domains. Neural networks evolved into autonomous systems, capable of managing closed ecosystems and replicating adaptive solutions without external connection. On planetary surfaces, cities adapted to camouflage themselves from surveillance satellites. Buildings with attenuating surfaces, synthetic atmospheres filtered, heat disguised. Language turned into double code words with hidden meanings understood only within local context, and in the shadows. In the depths of those systems, the idea of a counterpulse arose, a reverse pulse that did not declare threat, but signaled life beyond programming. A kind of silent invitation, camouflaged in a frequency spectrum, monitored by other species without knowing what they were seeking. A pulse that said, "We exist. We are beyond prediction." A dissonant message that gathered not only shields but a fragile hope of rapprochement, but it played with time and tension. Would it be detected as danger or as a whisper of redemption? Meanwhile, movements emerged. Beneath the diplomatic surface, cracks in agreements came from dissension among worlds allied to the Council. Some alien leaders, bored with the monotony of static security, began to question hardened protocols. Perhaps human unpredictability is fuel for innovation, not a threat. Those few met in discreet chambers. Though supported by tradition, unsettled by audacity, they began flirting with restoring covert channels of dialogue, exchanges of data packets disguised under ceremonial rites, displaced transmissions like poetic messages coded as interstellar myths. They were tenuous measures, but enough. The first Lincoln echo of possibility among future organizations began to appear, an underground channel that wept resistance to the hegemony of fear. It would be fragile, but human. The narrative crowned itself thus. Humans learned they could become myth, that with silent precision they could navigate between dissonance and cooperation. The imponderable became an art of survival. Year after year, dozens of stealth jumps returned with signs of slow risk. Each restored route was a risky, anticipated step, almost a restrained diplomatic pulse. Encrypted communications returned through official channels, with visible distrust yet returned. The human lost galactic market was reborn in small niches of adapted foods. Folk remedies, emerging artistic languages, were celebrated as cultural commodities, inscribed not in formal treaties, but in agreements of curiosity. But the reconstructed silence was different. There are marks in the void. Peace ceased to be eternal. It became shrapnel, and humans learned to make unpredictability a gift. They became a roaming specter, unpredictable, strategic, hermetic. Galactic civilization entered a rhythm of shared uncertainty. A silent pulse could say more than armored shielding. And those who had challenged the silence became witnesses to a new order where the shadow turned weapon, and the voice was the most dangerous mystery. In the end, while physical borders existed, the real borders lay in communicated silences. Human connections were rare, fragile, intense. We learned to live between echoes and promissory notes, and the entire universe learned that humans go unnoticed until the exact moment. And so, under the stars that once promised eternal peace, the glimmer of calculated unpredictability was lit. Not merely power, but a condition of existence. The human psyche, under forced isolation, showed unexpected resilience. The lack of contact with the council did not bring collapse, but adaptation. In the farthest colony worlds, social systems transformed. Culture, deprived of external influences, turned inward. New forms of art emerged not as expressions of beauty, but as responses to the imposed silence. Hymns written without words, symphonies based on the gravitational patterns of orbiting moons, literature composed in non-visible spectra. It was as if language itself had to evolve to cross the undeclared barriers of surveillance. Education began to treat geopolitics not as a map of borders but as a cartography of perception. Children learned that to exist was not to be present, but to be remembered with fear. History was rewritten without pride, but with surgical precision. The bluff had worked, and that, in itself, was frightening even to those who had carried it out. It was an achievement, but also a curse. Uncertainty had become the most valuable currency of human power, but also its burden. Meanwhile, inside the council's hidden chambers, debate never ceased. The most traditional factions demanded definitive containment measures. Some called for total blockade of the human zone. Others suggested direct interference in Earth's communication systems, discreet sabotage, reverse mimetic invasions, but no firm action was taken because even among the counselors themselves, there was fear of After all, the original bluff had been ridiculously simple and, yet it had paralyzed the diplomatic machinery of the entire galaxy. Among the young on the central worlds, movements of fascination arose. Humans began to be studied not for their technological feats but for their capacity to unbalance through the unthinkable. Some called it the strategy of the abyss, coming so close to the edge that your enemies step back, not from fear of the fall, but from your willingness to jump. It was behavior that defied logic yet produced results. In secret alien universities, entire departments dedicated to strategic human psychology began to appear. Tactical simulations were created to replicate human response patterns, and no algorithm could completely predict the next move. Machines, programmed for logical reasoning, failed before contradictory stimuli. Humanity, which could barely colonize half the neighboring systems, became the academic focus of millennial empires. On Earth, the mood was one of silent mutation. There was no euphoria, there was continuous tension. Political leaders, initially proud of the bluff's impact, now faced the real ramifications: cultural embargo, cold surveillance, frozen diplomacy. They gathered in underground command bunkers to decide the future of a civilization treated as an anomaly. And even so, there was no regret, because the alternative would have been submission. Then Project Layer Zero emerged. It was a plan of controlled rupture, not of war but of amplified doubt. Using quantum communication systems spread across isolated colonies, humanity would begin to emit multiple energy pulses, each with slightly incompatible signatures. The goal was not to communicate anything, it was to saturate the spectrum, to confuse further, to create the impression of multiple diverging civilizations under a single banner. The idea was that the more fragmented the human image, the harder it would be to attack. You do not fight what you do not understand. It was chaos as defense. During the project's first 2 cycles, galactic sensors recorded 39 distinct pulses, all from sectors under human control. The Council's response was intensified surveillance, but they could not act with hostility, for they still did not understand the meaning. No one knew whether this was the prelude to a new weapon, political fragmentation, or a disinformation. In one intercepted transmission, a senior counselor asked, "What if they are testing our ability to maintain balance without breaking the peace?" The question went unanswered. The fear was no longer of a human attack. It was the fear that the Council itself might no longer be the most unpredictable force in the galaxy. Slowly, humanity became the antithesis of the Council. While ancient civilizations celebrated predictability, eternal treaties, and fixed formulas of diplomatic behavior, humans venerated the exception, the deviation, the break, that made them dangerous, but also fascinating. And with that, humanity stopped being merely tolerated, it began to be observed with cautious reverence. The next phase of the project would not be authorized. It would be triggered automatically if the system detected hostile movements. It was the reverse silence, a set of energy pulses that would mimic the collapse of civilizations. The plan was simple: to feign the end of humanity, to hide to the point of appearing eradicated, and then, years later, to reemerge in silence. The preparations were made. The most distant colonies deactivated their traces. Transport ships were buried, satellites were switched off with reactivation codes scheduled for future dates. Entire databases were removed from the external mesh. Earth itself entered inert transmission mode. End in the Council. The sudden absence was read as a sign, but of what? Withdrawal, defeat, a trap. The galaxy hung suspended for an entire cycle, and then a single message appeared, from an unlikely location, a rocky planet, uninhabitable, classified as dead for millennia. The message was short, just 2 symbols, an echo of the first bluff, and a new character that, even when translated by multiple cultures, always represented the same thing. Uncertainty, asterisk, asterisk. As the stars seemed to quiet, the galaxy plunged into mystery. The rocky planet that had been marked as uninhabitable became the stage for something everyone awaited and feared to decipher. The two symbols, pulsing at irregular frequency, echoed like enigmas among civilizations seeking order and chaos. With no official declarations, no banners revealed, had humanity been reborn? In those moments, the Council convened an extraordinary session, but there was no escaping doubt. Every intelligent planet observed the void, gauged the gravity of that voluntary disappearance. A silence so artfully made that it felt like an explosion. From isolated colonies to central worlds, communication networks began to investigate, to try to decode the symbols. Probes were sent, hidden data packages, encrypted memories, in the hope of finding life for cause. But nothing came, only echoes of something receding. And so the legend of the human silent eruption was born. Many came to believe we withdrew because we could not resist. Others swore it was a trap, but no high-logic interpreter could decipher it. Galactic centuries later, when the diplomatic noise subsided, human transmissions returned. It was a simple signal, not threatening, yet laden with implication. We are here, we endure. The universe was redefined. Unpredictability became legacy. The human essence, nothing more than calculated silence, had prevailed where force would have failed, and thus, amid fragments of frayed peace and echoes of constant action, humanity learned its definitive role, to exist as possibility, not as demonstrated power. A myth sailing among empty roots, waiting for the exact moment to reappear in the void, redefining the future through absence and return.